In the penultimate decade of the 19th century, Otto von Bismarck was at the zenith of his power. Domestically, his position as chancellor was secure, supported firmly by the elderly Kaiser Wilhelm. Internationally, Bismarck's diplomatic strategies seem to have nearly dominated European politics. Austria and Russia, the two other major empires on the continent, were allied with Germany through the renewed Three Emperors League. Italy maintained a friendly relationship thanks to the newly formed Triple Alliance. Meanwhile, France, though intensely adversarial, remained isolated. Despite this strong position, potential challenges loomed on the horizon, particularly as the Habsburg and Romanov empires continued to have disputes. The Balkans could potentially see France escape its isolation or initiate a war of retribution. However, Bismarck relished the challenges these issues presented. In 1882, his influence and focus on international politics grew even more. That year, in an effort to reinstate the Khedive to power in Egypt, British forces occupied the nation instead of withdrawing a few weeks later as anticipated. Prime Minister William Gladstone soon realized that sustaining the Khedive's authority necessitated a semi-permanent presence of British troops. Unfortunately for London, this decision came at the cost of straining relations with one of its key European partners. Throughout the 1870s, France and Britain had frequently collaborated in international matters through an informal liberal alliance. However, Paris had significant interests in Egypt, and Britain's unilateral occupation was viewed as a humiliation, nearly as unforgivable as Germany's annexation of Alsace-Lorraine 12 years prior. This situation was compounded by Whitehall's ongoing antagonism towards Russia over the Straits, and Gladstone's intermittent criticisms of both Austria and Turkey as disreputable autocracies.
Britain found itself utterly reliant on German goodwill to avoid complete isolation within Europe. Bismarck, ever the strategic patriot, was quick to exploit this position to Germany's advantage. One notable instance of his maneuvering came when he pressured Britain into retreating on a series of colonial claims. While this was arguably the most conspicuous demonstration of Bismarck flexing his newfound leverage, the gravity of Britain's vulnerable position in Europe should not be underestimated. On a personal level, Bismarck harbored no genuine animosity towards Britain, yet the specter of coercion loomed ominously over Whitehall. When Gladstone left office in 1885 and was succeeded by the Marquis of Salisbury, Britain's predicament had become dire. With no allies on the continent and nearly complete dependence on Bismarck's patronage, Salisbury was deeply alarmed. He recognized that a mere shift in German policy against London could potentially open the floodgates for continental powers to partition Britain's empire. While such an extreme move was not actively pursued or desired by Bismarck, the unspoken threat amplified London's vulnerability and, simultaneously, enhanced Berlin's leverage and opportunities for gain. This, then, established the framework for the subsequent 5 years of Anglo-German relations. Salisbury indeed hoped to extricate Britain from the diplomatic predicament she found herself in, while Bismarck aimed to keep her entangled. Initially, the Iron Chancellor paid little attention to Britain's new Prime Minister, whom he had referred to as the obstinate lay clergyman during their encounter 7 years prior at the Congress of Berlin. It is not difficult to understand why Salisbury's first ministry was short-lived, lasting only 6 months, as the British political landscape nearly disintegrated over the contentious issue of Irish Home Rule. The division within Gladstone's Liberals on this matter allowed Salisbury to return to power by July 1886, although it took another 6 months before he could assume the Foreign Office and firmly establish his influence over British policy. This contextual background is crucial to consider when reflecting on why Bismarck often found the British political system frustrating and initially underestimated. A statesman cannot create anything on his own. He must wait and listen until he hears the steps of God sounding through events, then leap up and grasp the head of his garment.
according to a certain Otto von Bismarck, as John Charmley notes. However, it had taken Salisbury to ride that look. Prestige counts as a weapon in international affairs. Salisbury had to act without it when he first entered the Foreign Office, but by the time he left, he had acquired it. It was a currency that Bismarck, more than anyone, understood and respected, and from that point on, he would be far less dismissive of the British Prime Minister. This part of the Bulgarian squabble had occurred during Salisbury's brief government in 1885. When he returned to office in the middle of 1886 at the head of a more stable ministry, Bismarck welcomed him.
The Prime Minister's objective was to build upon his earlier achievements by fostering close ties with Germany, while ultimately seeking to escape her influence. He aimed to accomplish this by negotiating a settlement with France regarding Egypt and mending relations with the Ottoman Empire, which had once again been strained by Gladstone. However, he faced opposition from his own chancellor, Randolph Churchill, who also desired amicable relations with Bismarck, but believed that a formal alliance with Germany was the solution. This alliance would enable him to reduce defense expenditures, a notion that horrified nearly everyone in the Tory party, including Salisbury himself. The proposed defense cuts and a formal alliance would effectively render Britain a permanent German satellite, incapable of acting independently or exerting military force. Salisbury wished to collaborate with Bismarck, but his primary concern was to preserve Britain's autonomy at all times.
Churchill's proposals quickly alienated him from all support within the Tory party, allowing Salisbury to easily counter an attempted resignation bluff against him. Nevertheless, while the Prime Minister had solidified his domestic position, he remained on unstable ground internationally. Despite France and Germany experiencing heightened tensions, with war being predicted in various circles, Paris continued to reject any settlement regarding Egypt. The Ottomans also showed reluctance to renew the old alliance. Consequently, Salisbury would remain reliant on Germany for the time being. Ultimately, the resolution emerged from southern Europe. The problem for Bismarck was that Russia's trajectory was inevitably expansionary toward Constantinople and then the eastern Mediterranean. In August 1886, a group of Russian-backed officers kidnapped Prince Alexander, who soon afterward abdicated. The growing split between Vienna and St. Petersburg over the Bulgarian crisis made Bismarck fear that the Three Emperors League would be terminated when it came up for renewal in 1887. If that happened, its restraining influence on Russia would disappear, and Russia and Austria could once again find themselves in direct conflict.
Supporting either side could bring Bismarck's entire diplomatic system crashing down, but doing nothing could also lead to an open clash between his allies. He believed the solution was to have Britain pull his chestnuts out of the fire once again. If Britain supported Austria in the Mediterranean, Russia would be deterred, or at least distracted into quarreling with someone other than Germany. This would allow Bismarck to preserve his friendship with Vienna without having to openly side against St. Petersburg. Salisbury understood that this situation gave him leverage, although he also believed that an agreement with Austria and Italy would benefit Britain regardless. At first, however, he held back, wondering what Bismarck would offer Britain in return for joining an Austro-Italian bloc in the Mediterranean. Bismarck's answer was that he would support Britain's occupation of Egypt. Although this was a relatively minor concession for Bismarck to make, it was a major diplomatic victory for Salisbury, as it left France isolated in its opposition to the British occupation. The terms of the First Mediterranean Agreement, which consisted of a series of secret notes rather than a formal treaty, were deliberately vague. In essence, however, Italy, Austria, and Britain agreed to cooperate if Russia made any serious move toward the Straits. Bismarck had ultimately achieved his objective of tying London more closely to Vienna. He then moved quickly to capitalize on the concession he had made over Egypt by suggesting, or more accurately, pressuring, Britain to commit to maintaining the occupation for the foreseeable future,
a quicksand Salisbury really sought to escape as soon as was convenient. When he wants us, as he evidently does, to quarrel with France downright over Egypt, I think he's driving too hard a bargain, muttered Salisbury. Egypt is a disastrous inheritance, for it enables the Chancellor to demand rather unreasonable terms as the price, not of his assistance, but of his refusal to join a coalition against us.
Nonetheless, the First Mediterranean Agreement had allowed Salisbury to put Britain on firmer ground internationally. Austria and Italy were now friendly, even if their formal commitments to cooperation extended only to the Mediterranean. Salisbury was able to justify the arrangement to the Queen by arguing that it was the best means of warding off a continental league. In this assessment, he was right. Even after the brief revival of serious Franco-German tensions had died down in 1888, Bismarck refused to pursue a more serious détente with France. Doing so would have meant reversing course and supporting Paris's position over Egypt, which would then lose Austria and Britain's support in the Mediterranean and the Balkans, potentially creating an Austro-Russian crisis. This was a diplomatic house of cards, but in some sense, one Salisbury had stacked in his favor. France and Russia's hostility toward Britain still gave the Iron Chancellor options, but Britain could no longer be blackmailed by the implicit threat of a continental coalition. What crowned Salisbury's success and turned the whole situation on its head was the Second Mediterranean Agreement in late 1887. By this point, Bismarck's Three Emperors League had collapsed, not least because of the wedge Salisbury had driven into it over the Bulgarian issue. Germany instead replaced it with the new bilateral reinsurance treaty where Russia was concerned, while maintaining the Triple Alliance with Austria. Formal Austro-Russian cooperation thus broke down, and St. Petersburg resumed a threatening attitude toward Bulgaria. Combined with a Franco-Russian effort to torpedo a British convention with the Sultan, it seemed that an aggressive new alliance between the two, aimed at the Balkans and the Straits, might be in the offing. Although Salisbury was annoyed by the destruction of his efforts to reconcile with the Turks, it was no longer a vital issue for Britain. The possibility of a Franco-Russian alignment aimed at the Balkans was far more worrying for the Triple Alliance, Bismarck included. The Second Mediterranean Agreement was proposed to Salisbury and pressed on him by Bismarck. Because of this, unlike the first agreement, where Salisbury was trying to escape isolation, there was no obvious danger requiring Britain to accede. So, the Prime Minister played a waiting game. As discussed, Bismarck had remained aloof from the earlier negotiations, keen to let Britain take on the burden of defending Austria. But back then, Britain had been isolated. Now, it was Bismarck who was on the hook, and Salisbury had a price for letting him off. The Prime Minister asked exactly what Bismarck's commitments to Austria were when it really came down to it. If there was a genuine Austro-Russian flare-up, which of his allies would Bismarck support? The Chancellor replied with a 20-page document, which can basically be summed up in one word: Austria. Germany would not allow Austria to be dismembered. For Salisbury, this was everything he needed to know. Until then, he had never been exactly sure what Bismarck would do in a European war. Now he could safely commit to the Second Mediterranean Agreement, knowing he was effectively tying Germany, even though she made no formal commitment to a bloc meant to bar Russian expansion. Bismarck had always wanted to make it seem as though he would never choose between Austria and Russia, and publicly that remained the case. But in private, Salisbury now knew better. In little over 2 years, he had escaped international isolation, erected a formidable barrier to any Russian aggression, and wriggled Britain off Bismarck's diplomatic hook. He had done so without sacrificing British interests or making commitments that conflicted with those interests. For Bismarck, the opposite was true. He had started off by being able to blackmail Britain into giving up its colonial claims. He ended up
being blackmailed by Britain into giving up the secrets of his Austrian alliance, and thus committing Germany to fight Russia if it came down to it. It was not a great defeat.
It hardly destroyed the Bismarckian system, nor did it prove a barrier to friendly relations with Britain. Indeed, Bismarck now spoke of Salisbury's friendship as being worth more than 1,000 African swamps. But it was the kind of vexation Bismarck was unaccustomed to. The Iron Chancellor was losing his grip, not just on foreign policy, but on the course of the German Empire. His patron, the old Kaiser, was dying and would soon be replaced by the forceful Wilhelm II. A new era of European diplomacy was about to begin, but Salisbury had ensured Britain would enter it with a strong hand.
And so, as the old Kaiser's reign drew to its final close, a new and uncertain era of European diplomacy stood on the horizon, one where the Iron Chancellor's grip would begin to slip, and where Lord Salisbury's quiet, patient statesmanship had already reshaped the balance of power. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of 19th century diplomacy, don't forget to like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe so you never miss the next gripping story from the Age of Empires. The rise of Wilhelm II is just around the corner, and it will change everything. Stay tuned for the next episode.